All right, it's Flutter Friday, and a lot have happened since last time I had a Flutter Friday with an update. And the biggest one, or there are like two big things happening in the community. The first one, Flutter turned 10 years about a week ago, from the very first commit of Flutter till today. So happy birthday to Flutter. And next, there has been a fork of Flutter, and Matt Carroll, we invited as a guest to get a chance to ask our questions and hear him out to see what all that fuss is about. So without further ado, I'm introducing Matt here. Hi, Matt. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Victor. Good to see you. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, I know both of us worked at the Flutter team, but maybe you want to give us a short introduction of who you are.
Sure. There might be a lot of people in this audience that aren't familiar with me. So going all the way back to my pre-Flutter days, I was an Android developer for about 7+ years. That culminated in 3 years working at Nest on their Android app, at which point I discovered Flutter. I actually brought it into Nest for an internal project we were doing. And then I ended up joining the Flutter team. I was on the Flutter team for a couple of years. Most of that time was spent rewriting most of the Android embedding, which the irony there is I joined the Flutter team to escape Android, and then I spent almost all my time on the Flutter team writing Android code for Flutter. So it didn't quite work out the way I expected there. But in early 2020, I left the Flutter team, and it was primarily because I actually felt that I could do more to help Flutter adoption from outside the organization. And this goes to things like in the organization, you can be a framework contributor or you can be DevRel, but you can't be both. So either you're doing technical things or you're out there spreading the word, but you can't do both. There was also a lot of really tight policy on every time you go to a meetup, you have to run your script by us. The PR team has to approve everything you say. And so once you kind of added all of the restrictions, my view was I'm going to go out there, I'm going to start a YouTube channel on my own. I'm going to work with clients to help them get past their problems. I'm going to create open source packages to solve things that I think are missing in the community. And I'm going to educate people along the way. And even more recently, over the past year, Ray Lee and myself have co-hosted every week an open space on X where anybody gets to come and listen and come up on stage and share their experiences. So we're also fostering very open community discussions. That's been my life for the last 4 years. And I guess in a sense, Victor, that brings us to today.
All right. So I guess the biggest news from your side is you are planning a Flutter fork. And my question, and I'm sure very many others, are why? What are you thinking there?
Sure. Well, we'll talk about it today, but the announcement, which was made on Monday, included a fairly thorough description of why. So I just want to encourage those who maybe have seen this news flying around, but never actually read the thing that apparently started it. I have written about it, and I think it's pretty clear. I also presented last week at a Flutter meetup at a Google facility, in fact, to a room with about 30 community members and probably up to 10 members of the Flutter team. But for those who are here and haven't read it and didn't watch the presentation, I will boil it down to the following. It is fairly common for companies that depend upon Flutter to run into bugs that are very critical to them, bugs in Flutter that are critical to them, or features that seemed like they should have been a part of Flutter but somehow got overlooked. They just aren't available. And when a company runs into that problem, they only have 4 possible choices for what they do next. Option 1 is to just wait for the Flutter team to merge some kind of bug fix or merge some kind of feature, and then that company is unblocked and they can move forward. Option 2 is to use somebody else's fork of Flutter, which already has what they need. Option 3 is for them to fork Flutter themselves, a private fork for their own team. They fix the problem themselves and they build against their own fork. Or option 4, stop using Flutter. Now, Victor, if I were to ask you, Is one of those options exceptionally worse than the other? Does one of those stand out to you?
I mean, I think, I mean, my in the best of worlds, it would get into the official Flutter, the fix if you have one. And I have to say, our experience from like working on ServerPod, we ran into a number of bugs in Dart that we filed, and they were fixed like in a matter of days. From
Right,
filing
but
the bug report.
again, but to be clear though, of those those are the only four possibilities.
Yeah.
Of those four possibilities, is one of those worse than all the others?
I don't know. I mean,
Are-
using Flutter obviously is the worst.
let's not. There's no question here.
Yeah.
A company that stops using Flutter, that is the worst option of those three by a mile. And therefore, and let's be clear about why. It's not just bad for the company, it's bad for us. If a company stops using Flutter, those jobs go away. Those future jobs go away. And the message to nearby companies is maybe you should be skeptical of Flutter too. So let's not mince words on this because it's important to the community. The worst thing that can happen for us is that companies choose to stop using Flutter for reasons that they believe are at the feet of Flutter. Now, I'm not here to create a panic around that. I'm not saying, oh, a bunch of companies are abandoning it. What I'm doing is taking inventory of all the things that can happen when companies are blocked by Flutter. You pointed out that your bugs are fixed quickly. I'm not suggesting otherwise. Some companies get their bugs fixed very quickly. Super Editor, just to grab one example, and I don't want to focus too much on me because, Victor, you and I talked briefly before this that there's a little bit of a hate mob roaming Twitter right now. And one of the criticisms is that I've made this too much about me. So I want to try not to do that here. But just to offer my counterpoint to your personal anecdote, at Super Editor, we have filed dozens of tickets that have impacted our paying customers, people who depend on our package. And it is very rare that they get solved at all. We file it, and at this point, we actually internally, our assumption is filing is just a part of process. We don't actually expect the Flutter team to ever fix it. Occasionally they do, and we appreciate it, but our default assumption is that we have to find a hack that can bypass their limitation because we have not had that experience. And this has been going on for years, Victor. I also have I regularly have calls with my clients. All of them have run into situations like this. Not one of them, not all of them. And they've run into it multiple times. So one really important thing for people in the Flutter community to fully understand is that your good experience does not preclude someone else's bad experience. And me being a voice for the people who are having bad experiences is not a slight against those of you who had good experiences. People out there really need to understand that.
Right, of course. But you think, so I understand your thinking here for creating this fork. But maybe there could be other ways to build this in a stronger way, working together with the Flutter team or Google. Or you think that's like a dead end or have you tried?
So I'll also draw this back to another criticism we've gotten, which is, why don't you just send the team a letter? Why don't you just talk to the team? I've been sending them letters for 4 years, Victor. If they wanted to work with me, we'd be working together. I have never turned away a call. I've never turned away an email. I've never ignored one. I've never taken any step to not work with that team. But they sure have made it a hell for me to try to work with them. And again, I don't know if that's other people's experience or not. But when people say, Matt, why don't you try harder to work with the team? I'm like, what are you talking about? What is it I'm supposed to do? Am I supposed to just show up every day and say, hey, Flutter team, please tell me all the things I'm allowed to say, the way I can say it, what I should do, how I can help, and I will just fingers crossed that you guys do what I want. I've tried it. Jesse's tried it. Many others have tried it. And I understand the question for those who just don't know me, haven't been around when I've been going through these things. They don't use the packages that I work on. Fair enough. But yes, we've tried and we've tried. And even if we just want to chalk it up to, let's just say, conflicting personalities, that there's one type of personality on the team, and then there's a cohort of us who have a different personality. Okay, I at this point, I will accept that as a description. But the idea that we haven't tried is definitely not true. But let me give you an olive branch here, Victor. In the guidance that we're putting together for Flock, in the area for filing an issue with us, the first thing we say is there must be an existing Flutter ticket before you file a ticket with us. Meaning you must try to get your change into Flutter before you ask us to do anything about it. Because we're not here to diverge from Flutter. We really mean it when we say there are people who need things that aren't being served. So if you can be served, if, like you said, every bug you file gets merged, excellent. I hope you continue to file with Flutter, and I hope they continue to fix your bugs. For the company out there that's filing and begging and they can't seem to get their fix in or their feature in, I think we want a community pressure release valve, a place for them to go when the Flutter team is not the answer.
All right, I can understand that reasoning. So I have a few thoughts there. I spoke with Simon Lightfoot earlier this year, and they're looking at creating some sort of, I guess, Flutter Foundation or whatever you want to call it, bringing together a number of companies that can both work on, I guess, within the sort of Flutter ecosystem, help it in different ways, both contributing code, I'm sure, but also, help out with parts where the ecosystem is missing. For instance, an example I think that is pretty lacking right now is pub.dev, and their search engine is, can we say crap? But, you search
it's not good.
You search for server or backend, and the stuff that comes up is like the first 5 results are just like completely unrelated packages.
Oh, trust me, I know.
Server pod, frog like at the bottom, which is
I mean, speaking of which, feed, like you said, like, oh, just go work with the team or let the team know. As I'm sure you have, I've told them about the pub search problem many times. I've suffered from it. Simon suffered from it. They're well aware of it. And yes, I've also heard. Well, you continue, but yes, I've heard Simon talk about the same thing.
Yeah, but maybe doing it in that space could be less controversial and come together like
which space?
I'm thinking, I mean, it's not the space yet, I guess, but you could start building sort of a foundation before going into maybe making a fork is sort of a radical move. I get correct me if I'm wrong, but I get a little bit of feel like I mean, it is a little bit like a provocation towards the Flutter community, if you will. But maybe I would assume.
No, I'll have that argument with you. I'll have that argument with you.
Yeah.
So I've heard this plenty of times. The viewpoint is not new, but I could not disagree more with that. And what has happened is that this community has become so comfortable with stagnation. This community has convinced itself that pointing out uncomfortable truths is akin to being a bully. I hate it. I do not want to. I completely disagree with that. If you have an emotional reaction to someone else's description of a problem, that is not on the person describing the problem. Now, it's one thing if you say someone lied about a problem. That's very different. But if someone factually and reasonably describes a problem and then offers a reasonable solution, if the response is, how dare you rock the boat? How dare you create this PR firestorm for everyone? First of all, I didn't. A bunch of React Native trolls did. And there are some people in the community I'm very upset with who have put this at my feet. But unless you think I'm lying, I do not agree that there's this concept of provocation. I didn't make fun of anyone's appearance. I didn't call out anyone by name. I didn't say the Flutter org should be shut down. I didn't say Google is killing Flutter. I didn't say corporate people are terrible. There's a lot of things I didn't say, a lot of provocation that never happened. So I accept your opinion, but this is a place where I think the community has gotten it way wrong, and I completely disagree.
All right. I totally respect that, and I understand your viewpoint there. Um, so I have a few
Oh,
more
by
questions.
the way, you mentioned the foundation. Can I follow up on a few things there?
Oh, yeah.
So you and I both know Simon. Love Simon, great guy. And in fact, it would be awesome for you and me and Simon to come together and talk about these topics live. But the reason that I actually had the GitHub org for the Flutter Foundation is because Simon and I were talking about this back in like 2021. This is not a new topic.
Yeah.
And I would love to see him do the things you just said, but Simon has been saying he was going to do it since 2021. It just isn't happening. And I haven't, if there's stuff happening behind the scenes recently that I'm not aware of, I'd love for Simon to come out and tell us. But since 2021, I've been hearing, let's get companies together and create a foundation. So I had the GitHub org just sitting there lingering. And I thought, well, wait a second. If we're going to fork Flutter and try to create extensions for companies, wouldn't it be reasonable to think that if we're successful, those companies will eventually start funding development on Flock because they need the help? And at that point, wouldn't it actually end up becoming the very foundation that Simon and I had discussed for so many years? Wouldn't it kind of morph into that eventually? So why don't I just use this existing GitHub org with this existing name, and that will be the aspiration? We'll start small, we'll start simple, but the goal would be, let's create a place for companies to come together around Flutter, and then that name will make perfect sense. But a final follow-up to that, we have received a request to change that domain name, and I have a feeling that that request is going to convert into a demand. So in all likelihood, in the very near term, everybody who's been angry about it, you win. We will end up with a different domain name and a different GitHub org name.
All right. Okay, so I'm also super curious about the sort of practical aspects of how this would work. So if we move on to another question, is like, when is the fork happening? And in terms of infrastructure and cost for running tests and all those stuff, have you any thoughts on that? How?
Yeah. So on our website, again, the domain might be changing, so I can't even, I can share it here. It's right now, it's flutterfoundation.dev. I don't know what it's going to be tomorrow, but I've actually written the 3 phases of Flock development. Actually, even before we get in that, I just want to note something to the audience. There are 2 efforts here. One is a fork called Flock. The other is a set of tools called Nest. And I would like for us to spend some time on Nest at some point, but I'll answer the question here, which is about Flock.
All right.
The fork.
Yep.
So I've already published the 3 phases, and the expectation is like this. Phase 1, we need Flock to exactly mirror the Flutter framework. So the framework has a master branch, a beta branch, a stable branch, and a bunch of release tags. Those must exist exactly the same in Flock before we ever consider making any modification, because one of our primary directives here is that we want to be as close to Flutter at all times perpetually. How much or how little we diverge, that's a very open question for the future, but we're taking every step we can to be Flutter plus more stuff. So we've got to mirror the framework. Once we mirror the framework, we then have a similar challenge with the engine. But the engine, the challenge is a bit different. With the engine, we need to build the binaries. So for those Flutter users out there who don't know, when you're using the Flutter framework, you're literally using the Dart source code. You can actually change the framework code locally on your machine, rebuild, and you get the change. That's how nice the source code is. The engine is consumed as a precompiled binary. So when you say Flutter pub get and you watch this download, go, that's the Flutter engine binary being downloaded from a cloud provider somewhere. So with Flock, we need to run builds of the binary. We need to upload them to some kind of cloud storage. And then we need to alter or extend the Flutter tool so that when you run, in our case, FVM Flutter pub get, the engine that gets downloaded is the Flock version of the engine instead of the standard version of the engine. Now, at this point, that's phase 2. At this point, all we've done is exactly copy Flutter, not a single change at all. That's what brings us to phase 3, where we begin actually fixing bugs and adding features. I don't want to be prescriptive about that. I'm waiting to see what the community tells us they really need, but we're going to start as small as we can. We're going to start as safe as we can. And we're going to try to bring in reviewers and leads who will make sure that we continue to uphold Flutter's existing quality bar and that we minimize conflicts with Flutter itself wherever possible. So those are the 3 phases. And then once we're in phase 3, that's forever. That's the rest of Flock is phase 3. But those are the phases we're going through. We've already made some progress on both phase 1 and phase 2. And in fact, Jesse, who is my partner in this, he's coming up this weekend, and we're gonna sit down and hack on some of that infrastructure. Now, as for costs, at the moment, none of what we're trying to do has any cost, thanks to GitHub's free providing of Actions, CI, that kind of stuff. So running the actions to synchronize, free. Running tests, we might have to reconfigure the engine side of that, but like the framework tests, they run in GitHub already, so we're just going to run them in GitHub too. That's free. I think the engine tests will be free. The only thing that I know is going to cost something is cloud storage for the engine binary. I don't expect that to be a large cost because I think we'll probably just keep a few versions of the engine around, not all of them. And Jesse has some corporate resources that he can put towards that for at least the foreseeable future. So I think we're going to be fine on cost for the foreseeable future.
All right. So I've been running some pretty large open source projects, and you get a lot of contributions to those. Even, for ServerPod, we get quite a few, and not all of them, meet the bar, or maybe, goes in a direction where you want to take the framework necessarily. We have, sort of a vision where we want to go, and sometimes people fix things that are only really partial fixes to a larger problem, or they will, there are a lot of issues with many of the pull requests we get, right? So what are your thoughts on that? Like, who is going to decide if, you take something in a new direction that may, or if it's just a partial fix? I assume sometimes why the Flutter team is so slow moving is many of those requests or pull requests may be, missing tests. They may be not meeting the bar. They'll maybe have something that creates an issue with a future feature they're planning, stuff like that.
Yep.
How would you imagine you attack those problems with Flock?
Yeah. So I'll address that in a moment. With what you just described on the Flutter team side, do you believe that the Flutter team has taken all reasonable actions that they can to minimize the frequency of those things happening?
That I haven't got an answer to. Probably, I'm guessing probably not, but
yeah. So just spitball some things.
Yeah.
They don't have meaningful education around how to write a test, where to put a test, how to run tests locally, and yet they have unwavering demands that you do so. You mentioned future features. How is it that someone ended up conflicting with that and they didn't know? Well, the answer typically is that the Flutter team didn't bother to tell people they were doing that. So right off the bat, just to be clear, there are things that team could do to make that better. They've kind of been obvious things for the entire time the project has existed. And for whatever set of reasons, and there's always reasons, Victor, as you and I know, there's always reasons.
Yeah.
You ask, they've got a list of why they can't or won't or whatever. But whatever those reasons are, this many years into the project, they still haven't done those things. So, and why point that out? Well, because every place where the Flutter org maybe has chosen not to do facilitative things, those are opportunities that we can explore in Flock to do facilitative things. So for example, I am very hopeful that we're going to put out a lot of education around how to write tests, where to put them, how to run them locally. And my hope is that initially, when people put up PRs that lack tests, we're going to direct them to the documentation, and that over time, we will have a growing group of regular contributors who learn, who then are able to comply, who can provide the quality that you're pointing out is missing, and they can even help others do the same. I think we'll also try to be absolutely transparent about everything we're doing, everything we're not doing, and why, in the hopes that the other thing you pointed out doesn't happen, which is someone puts in a bunch of work into something that conflicts. And this also includes, like, we actually have to be pretty picky about what goes in, because we don't want to, like, some people are like, hey, go remove all the child properties from all the widgets to look like Swift UI. No, we're not going to go refactor the entire code base to remove the child property. So don't go spend your time working on that, because I'm telling you, we're not going to accept it. And here's one of the things about us not needing to kind of work in corporate speak. If something like that is proposed, myself and Jesse, we will just flat out say, no, we're not taking it. We're never going to take it. Don't ask again, and don't work on it. We don't need to kind of dress up our language there. We can just be very frank with people. Now, as for kind of the mechanics of it, if you're like, okay, Matt, so you show people how to write tests, and you're very transparent, but like, okay, you're still going to get PRs that aren't up to the bar. What do you do? First, I think you and I, both of us are open source maintainers. There's a certain level of lazy PR that obviously it just isn't going to go anywhere. The person came in, they threw some code together. It's awful code. There's no comments, no docs, no tests. They didn't explain it. They just expect us to merge it. No, we can't merge that. That will never be workable. And so I don't have any problem in saying we will tell those people, you have one more chance to get it right, or to actually try. And if you don't do it pretty quick, we're just going to close the PR. And I don't think that's kind of aggressive against that person. That person brought their laziness into a chaotic project. We've got to prune that. But let's look at something, Victor, that also happens quite a lot. Someone who gets the PR 80 to 90% of the way through, but simply doesn't have the knowledge to do the last 10 to 20%.
Yeah, that's a very common scenario, I would say.
Right. And this is just aspirational, but I really want to bring in reviewers who have an honest desire to help those people get the last 10 to 20% of the way. I don't want reviewers who just declare that some policy isn't met. I want them to really get involved. And even if that means the reviewer takes over the PR and finishes it, great. I'm totally happy with that. But I really want to have reviewers come in who understand we on the Flock side are community members. The contributors are community members. The companies using this are community members. Let's work together here instead of just quoting policies at each other. Let's find out how to get things moving forward. And I don't think there's any easy button to that, Victor. I think that's like on a case-by-case basis, person-by-person basis. What do we do and how do we do it? And it even goes to the issue of personalities. We're gonna have to be mindful of the different personalities involved. We're gonna have to be mindful of people who speak different languages where we have communication barriers. I was telling Jesse recently, we should really try to source some reviewers who are fluent in some of these languages where we tend to get a lot of contributions. Because I remember on the Flutter team, we would absolutely get issues and PRs contributed, like for people from China, and their English was very broken. And as much as I wanted them to be helped, I couldn't tell what they were trying to say, and they couldn't understand my question. And so I would love for us to have some reviewers who can come in and have a totally fluent back and forth so we can get to the technical part and not get stuck at the human part.
All right. So I have another question here, and that's like how to keep this up to date with Flutter. So I have some thoughts there, but I'm curious to hear how you see it's possible to keep it up to date with Flutter. So imagine a couple of scenarios here that could cause trouble. The first one is, merge conflicts, obviously. But imagine that you have a feature that is that you added to your fork, to Flock, and then maybe 6 months later, the Flutter team finally, get their ass out of the wagon and makes that feature with a different API. Then all of a sudden you have like a conflict that is not necessarily mergeable in a meaningful way, and you have maybe a couple of users that are using Flock, and when they update, their app will be broken because,
Right.
if you choose the Flutter implementation.
So that I would still categorize that as a merge conflict. There are different ways to conflict, but that sounds like another version of conflict.
Yeah.
If nothing else, the moment we try to run that PR, our tests will fail based on that issue. So it ends up being the automatic synchronization script ran and the PR broke. So it's all the same kind of problem, which is we tried to automatically update and something went wrong. What do you do?
Right.
There's no panacea here. There's no easy button. Once again, this is kind of a case-by-case issue, but let's at least talk about tactics here.
Yeah.
So for example, someone has already dropped by our repo and they've said, listen, there's this Cupertino picker dialog, something or other, which has been out of date for like 2 years and the team just won't seem to update it. Can you update it? I think what we would actually do if we took that on is I think we would create a Flock directory inside of Flutter, and we would add and we would copy the existing widget over to the Flock directory, then update it and make that widget available under the Flock namespace. And the reason that's a tactic here is because the Flutter team never has any reason to ever put something under a Flock directory, unless like there's like literally the Flutter team's like, we hate Flock, we're going to make their job impossible. But other than that, there's no reason for them to have a Flock directory or a Flock namespace. And so anything we do in that namespace cannot conflict with anything the Flutter team is going to do. So that right there off the bat, things that are added, we should be able to avoid conflicts. That doesn't avoid conflicts and mutations. But what that means is every time we can add instead of change, we're going to add instead of change, so that in your example, when the Flutter team creates their version, which is going to be in package material or package Cupertino or whatever that is, we will add a deprecation warning to our Flock code. We'll give people a reasonable time to get off of it. They'll move to the Flutter version, and then we will delete it. We're going to try to be serious about deleting deprecated code, pruning it to remain as close to Flutter as possible. And a reason why I think that's very reasonable for Flock is because here's how I actually think Flock is going to be used. I think companies need something. We're going to get it into Flock. They're going to use Flock for a couple of their releases. Then Flutter's going to add it. Then they're going to move back to Flutter, off of Flock back to Flutter, until the next time this happens. I think Flock is going to be a place that you go to, and then you go back, and then you go to it, and then you go back. I don't think that companies are likely to have a permanent dependency on Flock unless there's something we add that the Flutter team simply does not want.
All right. So in the case you're describing here, couldn't that just have been a external package?
It was gonna in that particular case. I think the answer is yes, and in fact, that's the question I've asked that person in the issue ticket. I'm saying, is there a reason this can't be a package? There will be cases where it can't be. There'll be places where really the right place is the framework. We will try to push everything to packages that we can, because again, we take very seriously the idea that we do not want to diverge any more than we have to. So if we can reasonably go into a package, we will. But there will be cases where something needs to be added. Like another example is, I mean, not a specific example, but a case is, even if we add something to the Flock namespace, what if that Flock part itself utilizes something inside the framework? So the framework doesn't depend on Flock, but Flock internally needs maybe even some private stuff in the framework. That will still avoid merge conflicts, but it has to be in the framework. It can't be in an external package. And in fact, I'll give you another example here. Two somewhat related examples. Flutter's IME system is a mess.
IME, can you?
Oh, sorry. Input method editor. So in every operating system, even if you're using a physical keyboard, it's not the individual key presses that go into an application. I mean, the application can listen to key presses, but that's not what happens when you're editing text. There's an invisible intermediary subsystem in the operating system called the IME, the input method editor. The keyboard information flows into that, and then that thing talks to your app, and then your app talks to that thing. So if you're dealing with text fields or document editors, anything like that, the IME is critical. That integration is a mess. It's been a mess. It will hopefully get there's one change I'm very hopeful for in the near future that'll make it a lot better. But it's pretty easy to imagine that a company might need IME capabilities that don't currently exist in the Flutter APIs. That has to go. It's actually part engine, part framework. You literally can't do that in a package because Flutter installs itself as the delegate for all of those messages. Nothing else can be the delegate. With access to the framework and the engine, we can kind of dig in there and tunnel out a few new APIs. And that's what we would try to do. Instead of altering the existing Flutter APIs, in private code, we would fork some of the messages from the IME into a new Flock API, which you could use. And then once Flutter adds that to the Flutter API, we delete the Flock one. But that's an example of something that cannot go into a package. And yet there might be a way for us to do it in an additive manner that minimizes or eliminates conflicts.
Yeah, all right. So imagine I'm a Flutter developer. How would I know, like, it's such a, in a sense, Flutter is a pretty vast project, right? How would I know what I can use or what's added to the Flock fork? Like, how do I know if I will get value out of using Flock or not for my project?
Well, if you're one of those companies that gets blocked, it's going to be pretty obvious that you're getting value, right? If we unblock you.
For sure, but how would I know? How would I know that feature that's blocking me are in Flock? Will you keep some sort of a record over all the changes you have made?
Yeah, and the exact format of that we haven't decided yet. But not only are we going to have something akin to release notes, but in fact we probably need something deeper than that. In fact, tying this back into your merge conflict question, our ability to resolve conflicts in perpetuity requires a very clear history of who changed what, when, and why. And it's kind of easy to say, well, okay, that's just in Git. The risk with Git is that what if for some reason part of that history gets merged together or rewritten, and then you lose that information, or it becomes difficult to ascertain the information? That's a risk factor that Jesse and I are talking through. One person who came to talk to us from the community they said that Electron actually saves. Electron has two major upstream projects they bring into one. One of them is Chromium, obviously for the browser. I don't remember what the second one is, but they're actually rolling two massive projects together. And so what the Electron project decided to do was to literally save their patches as files in their repo. And so every patch is like, this person, this date, for this reason made this change. And I thought that was a really interesting idea. Maybe we're going to try that too. Because when that conflict arises, first we need to know exactly why our change was in there. Like, because, okay, let's be honest. Those conflicts, they're going to come up 6 months after the person made the change, right? You're going to be way removed from whenever the person actually put that change in there.
Yeah.
So whoever's dealing with that merge conflict at the time needs to know, who can I reach out to get clarity on this? Why was it done? And therefore, what is a reasonable resolution to the merge conflict? And so maybe that patch system will be a good answer down that direction. Maybe we'll explore something else, but 100%, it will need to be very publicly visible and understandable what we did, who did it, why they did it, and when they did it. Absolutely.
So do you imagine you must have some ideas of where you think this is going in terms, will it be mostly smaller bug fixes here and there, and some added, packages that need integration with Flutter, or are you thinking like bigger features?
Early, early on, yes, because like I mentioned before, at the beginning of phase 3, the whole goal is to prove out the protocol with the absolute minimal changes, the absolute safest work. So starting off, yeah, we're going to look for, and not just any bugs, but like, what are the critical ones? What are bugs that are in people's way or really blocking people? Let's focus on those. And we will try to slowly but methodically fix this bug here, fix that bug there, and see and monitor this system as it auto merges. And with the people who volunteer to help with this, as we do that, we're going to say, okay, here's the conflict among this group of volunteers. How do we effectively resolve this? Let's all learn together. Let's align. And as we solve more bugs, deal with more conflicts, create more tooling, this will get easier and easier, faster and faster. And then we can start talking about, if it makes sense, certain features. So, for example, one thing, I already mentioned IME, and that's very real. That is a very big problem for a subsection of the Flutter community. We might try to actually add some stuff there as features. Also, access text layout and glyph paths. Now, I don't mean to make this too much about me. This is just an area where I spend a lot of my time. So you may have seen those snazzy little text-based animations from Swift UI. Have those come across your feed?
Are you thinking like in text messages?
No, I mean, like, so there have been some videos posted of Swift UI examples where individual characters of text are flying around the screen and animating. Have you seen that?
I don't think I've seen that. So.
Okay, that was, I think many of us know that every few months, some little Swift UI feature becomes like the hottest thing on the internet, and everyone's like, oh my God, that's so amazing. This is changing the world. One of the more recent ones was the ability to animate individual characters of text.
Okay.
And there's probably a few different ways that can be done, but at the end of the day, you probably just need access to the actual glyph paths to do that.
Yeah.
And Flutter just doesn't provide that. Flutter could, it's probably there's a part of Skia that does provide that, and it's part of Skia that Flutter said, you don't need it, so we're not going to compile it. I think Jesse and I would like to expose that in Flock at some point.
Yeah.
And there's a similar issue with text layout. When you lay out text, I think a portion of the SK paragraph behavior is just not provided. There, you can kind of lay out paragraphs. You can't really lay out glyphs. It's a real pain. It's not really optimized for that. This was actually, I can't remember how long, maybe a year and a half ago, something like that. I was literally implementing PDF rendering in Flutter. And by that, I don't mean showing bitmap images of PDFs. I mean, I was scraping the 100,000 operations out of a PDF page, and I implemented Flutter versions of every PDF operation. So like, draw this glyph here, draw that curve there, all that kind of stuff. And we got most of it in a pretty good state, but by far, the thing that made it so non-performant that we could never ship it was the text layout system. That because Flutter essentially only exposes tools to lay out a paragraph, we were running paragraph layout on every glyph on the entire page. So like 1,000 glyphs on a page, and we're creating 1,000 paragraph objects and running paragraph layout. So it was unworkable. And we had calls with the engine team. We showed them what the problem was, and it just wasn't a priority for them. So I would like to see, in terms of, because you asked about features, I would like to see us add some glyph and text layout and font related capabilities that some projects really do need, but it's unlikely to make it into Flutter anytime soon, because from the Flutter team's perspective, that's a very niche requirement. Like if you look at all apps from their perspective, it's niche, but it increases the binary size of every Flutter application, and so they don't want to do that.
All right. So for that, take that as an example, exposing the paths for the glyphs through the engines. you don't just have the ski engine. You also have like probably impeller now. There are, you know, lots of tests to be written for this. There are, I'm sure. I could imagine building a feature like that if you do it like properly, so it works everywhere reliably. Maybe is it a month of work full time for someone? I'm just like, you know, ballparking here, but many of these features, I imagine, like Google are not picking up themselves because there's a huge time investment, and maybe the user they think needs that are not that many. But obviously, they are out there for doing things like
Yeah, so
those cool text animations. But
let's
I'm just
okay.
thinking, you're thinking, who do you imagine would spend that month and have that sort of competence to do that in a you know, serious way? And also doing a code review for a change like that is probably, you know, quite a bit of work as well.
Yeah. So there's a few different issues all coming together there.
Yep.
On the reviewer front, we want to recruit a really great set of leads. Leads are people with particular expertise in the Flutter project who can direct efforts. These are the people who kind of have the final say. Like imagine like an Android lead, a web lead, a framework lead, people who have a really great understanding of these parts of Flutter, and they can kind of say, yes, we want to go that direction. No, we don't. Yes, that's tractable work. No, it's not. And they kind of have the final call for their area of Flutter. But to the question of like, would anybody be willing to support that? I don't want to say that we're going to bring in any funding because that's a totally separate problem space. But let me go back to that PDF example. Both Simon and I were working on that. We were working for a client. He and I were paid for months to figure this out, and we were toiling away, spending our time trying to work around Flutter because we couldn't work with Flutter. So we were paid months to try to figure this out. And we tried we integrated multiple different C packages that actually read font files, calculate the paths. We actually implemented 3 different text rendering systems ourselves by integrating those C packages. So that money was spent, the expertise was there. What wasn't there was a fork of Flutter. Now, we probably could have forked Flutter, and maybe if we had done that from the beginning, we actually could have solved the problem for real faster. Because we kept trying to use the regular distribution of Flutter, we couldn't do it quickly. Like we couldn't get the team to help us, and we couldn't cram these external things in. And so after a few months, we had to call it. We had to say, listen, okay, the company already spent a bunch of money on us to do this, but we can tell that we haven't made the progress that we need. We can't get this where we need to go. So we've just got to kill the project. So again, to people who say, no, nothing's ever been killed because of limitations, you're wrong. We killed that project and we spent tens of thousands of dollars before we did it. So there are times and places where companies really do want this stuff. And because companies are based on revenue and costs, they may be willing to pay some people to actually bring that stuff into Flock. Not promising that, but that can happen, absolutely.
So imagine you spent that month and built that feature. It's like polished, it's Flutter quality. You don't think the Flutter team would accept it? Or
absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because of the same reason I just mentioned. From the Flutter teams, so the Flutter now, okay, so the engine is one big thing, right? You get the whole engine no matter what app. It doesn't have to be that way. Now, if the Flutter team wanted the engine in some fashion to be configurable, it could be. Not saying it would be easy or quick, but if the Flutter team wanted to create an opportunity to kind of have different sizes of engine, like a super simple, super tiny engine, a super big, super capable engine, they could do that. But because that's not the case, the Flutter team is hyper aggressive about not compiling in any APIs that do not meet a certain threshold of use in general. So like it's like unless 80% of apps are likely to need something, that's an arbitrary number, that's my number. But unless 80% of apps are going to need an API, we're not compiling it into the engine because that would inflate the binary size for 100% of apps.
Right.
So on the one hand, I understand that binary size is real. Android and iOS developers were complaining for years about binary size, and people like Michael Gotterbauer had to go deep into Flutter to tear out every kilobyte he could. I'm not insensitive to that. But now here's the other side of the coin. Now that Flutter goes to every platform, Flutter is used for an immensely diverse set of purposes. The least common denominator here, due to the binary size, will restrict the times and places that companies are able to use Flutter. Like, can Flutter be used to create Photoshop or After Effects? I don't think so. Like, I mean, there's Rive. They created the UI with Flutter, but Rive's entire actual rendering system is their own custom build. Now, maybe they would have done that no matter what, so they can control all the details. But just imagine that you wanted to bring in some of the graphic stuff that a Photoshop type of app has. A lot of that is in Skia, but a lot of it is not exposed through Flutter. Why? Because most apps aren't Photoshop. Most apps are nothing like it.
Right.
But the Flutter organization kind of needs to start contending with the reality that not every app is the average app. And some apps that otherwise could very much benefit from Flutter are going to be specialized, and they're going to need pieces of Skia or similar things that exist. They exist in the world, but the Flutter org did not compile them in the interest of not inflating the binary size for an Android app, for example.
All right. You think it would be possible to do some sort of tree shaking for those features, or is that like?
Well, yes, there are many options. There are many options.
I'm just curious about your thoughts there.
Even compiler flags, right? Like if you're building your own engine, well, okay, so there are a few different options. The Flutter team could choose like 5 arbitrary buckets of functionality, and they would be arbitrary and it wouldn't be perfect. But the Flutter team could be like, here are the 5 different sizes and capabilities of our engine, and all 5 of those engines could be uploaded to cloud storage where they already store the engine. And then when you do a Flutter pub get, you specify which one you want. Okay, so it just downloads the one that you want. Or if it can't be automated, let someone go to a website, click the things they need, and get the closest version of the engine. Or add compiler flags. When someone builds the engine, what pieces do you need? Now, I don't want to give the impression that any of this is quick or easy. It's not. Then again, the engine team just reinvented rendering, right? So if this team can build Impeller, I'm guessing they can figure out compilation flags. So it's difficult, it's tricky, but I believe those people are smart enough to do it if they wanted to, if there were a mandate. But I don't see this coming anytime soon, maybe ever. So to your previous question, would the team have accepted the addition of that glyph stuff and text layout? No, I don't think they would because of binary size.
All right. So that would be a consideration. If you use Flock, then you will get a bigger binary, most likely.
In that case, yes. If we did that, yes. But then again, I know Jesse is interested. Now, Jesse's the engine guy. Okay, I'm more of a framework guy. Jesse's the engine guy. But he's already talking about and thinking about, can we offer some engine compilation flags to optionally add things? Now, we can't break up the existing Flutter engine because, again, that would be a divergence nightmare. We're not gonna mess with that structure. But when we add stuff, can we find a way to make it optional? And if Jesse can figure that out, I think that's something that he's likely to do.
All right. So our time is starting to run out, but I have like a few more questions here. With so how is I know it's been pretty controversial, or like there've been a big blow up in the community from many different sides. But how is it, if you look to the positive aspects of this, how is it going? Do you getting any traction? Are you finding any leads? Because I guess your project will need a lot of very, very skilled people. You mentioned like an Android lead, and if you find an Android lead that is familiar with the Android or with the Flutter framework, probably not that many persons in the world that can take that position.
That one in particular is probably not too bad. I wrote most of that code, so I can probably help someone figure it out.
I'm sure there are other examples though.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts there, and how are things going? And do you have sort of a timeline for time you give this project to try it out, or?
Sure. So overall, far more positive than negative. So our announcement tweet has almost 700 likes, which I think in our little community is actually quite significant.
Yeah.
I've had somewhere between 20 and 30 people DM me personally saying, I love what you're doing. Either I want to contribute, I want to review, or I want to be a lead. We've had, I think, at least 10 people without even us. I don't even know how they got the URL, to be honest, but they made their way to our repository and started filing issue tickets. So about 10 people did that. And we've also seen in a few different venues, we've seen people start talking about their previous frustrations along these lines. There's a number of people who have kind of been silent about this up to this point, and this has been an opportunity for them to start saying, actually, yeah, I did have those problems. I did give up a few years ago because it was just too difficult to contribute. So we're also seeing more and more examples that the problem we describe is the problem we thought it was. Again, not everybody, but I just want to remind the Flutter community that when you get to the size of the Flutter user base, even 5% or 10% is a lot of people in a lot of pain. So let's not discount even a small percentage. But so overall, very positive in terms of numbers. Now, I will admit, with the nature of social media, the part that keeps repeating and really sticks out, and the stuff that ends up filling my feed, is a bunch of this really negative stuff. So I guess we don't need to go into that here, but that the last week of my life has been reading and getting bombarded with quite negative criticism from the Flutter community, in many cases from people that I actually know, which has been incredibly disappointing and disheartening. People whose work I have helped to promote before, who are now adding to this dog pile, coming after me just because we wanted to make the Flutter community healthier. And I will also mention, again, just on the social drama front, in a sense, I wish I could take credit for this reaction. The truth is, totally coincidentally, people over in the React Native community decided to share this. I have no idea why. I don't know. It's like every 6 months.
Jump on any chance to say that Flutter is dead, right?
Well, I think there are plenty of things they could jump on and they don't, and I don't know why. But it's like every 6 months, almost like clockwork. Like literally, do you know what 6 months ago was? 6 months ago, we were in April. That's when the Flutter team announced the layoff of like the 4 infrastructure people.
Yeah.
And that was the last time that every React Native person on earth was sharing Tombstone memes. In fact, the memes they're sharing now were recycled from the last time this happened 6 months ago.
Yeah.
And so that's the only reason most people saw this. When I put out the tweet, because I've published many blog posts, I've published many videos. I expected maybe a couple dozen people to respond in the comments. I knew some people wouldn't like it. I knew some people would. And I figured that would be it. And then Jesse and I would get to work. It ended up being a post seen by 200,000 people, over 600 likes, over 200 retweets, almost 100 replies. Hacker News picked it up. Some news articles, I use that term loosely because it looks like ChatGPT wrote them, but some news articles were written about it. That really has nothing to do with me. That has never happened with any other thing I've posted, and I have posted critiques before. So this was just a completely unpredictable event, and I'm trying to both embrace the positive while doing my best to kind of ignore the negative. And in fact, starting today, it's time to start muting accounts and blocking people because enough is enough. It's been a week. If people who still can't get over this, I don't need them filling up my timeline.
All right, fair enough. Thank you so much for taking the time today, and love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, likewise. I really appreciate you having me here, and I think you did a great job with those questions, and I think you're very objective. So thank you.
Thank you.